What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
We can safely assert that the Soviet passenger car industry as a phenomenon emerged thanks to cooperation with the Americans, more precisely, with the company Ford, because both GAZ-13 and Chaika were licensed copies of models made by Henry Ford. The pre-war executive limousine ZAS-101, as well as its successor under the Index 110, were also heirs of a couple of Americans. Buick 32-90 and Packard Super 8 respectively. In the appearance of post-war models there was also an obvious influence of the American school, especially in terms of appearance. This applied to the Pobeda, the 21st Volga, and the GAZ and ZAL limousines. Not surprisingly, many contemporaries of Soviet automobile artists immediately accused them of plagiarism, invariably citing a couple of Packards, Patrician and Caribbean, as the source. The front end of the Caribbean Packard has much in common with our Chaika. But no more than that indeed. At the end of 1955, the Research Automobile and Motor Institute purchased these models so that NOMI specialists, as well as engineers and designers of Soviet automobile plants could study the latest models of the American automotive industry. Undoubtedly, the exterior style of Packard cars made a certain imprint on the appearance of the Chaika, which was to catch up and overtake overseas potential classmates not only in terms of comfort, but also in terms of modernity of appearance, which could not be said about the archaic Zim GAZ-12. An interesting detail, GAZ designer Lev Yeremiev, who took part in the work on the appearance of the 21st Volga and their new Chaika, once worked on the appearance of the ZAM. The most surprising thing is that Yeremiev won the open competition related to the design of the future ZAL-111. That is why the Moscow and Gorky limousines are so similar to each other. However, one cannot claim that the sculptor Boris Lebedev, who together with a dozen other representatives of the creative team was engaged in the appearance of the new limousine, simply copied the design of the car from Packard. Keeping the pro-American image, the body received original proportions, because the Soviet car became a six-window car, while the Patrician had no additional glass behind the second pair of doors. Agree that these are similar, but still different cars, and in details GAZ-13 was distinguished by some original solutions, among which was a characteristic chrome bird on the rear doors, echoing similar details on the grille and trunk lid. The Caribbean was a two-door car with hardtop or convertible bodies. And it is unlikely that Chaika, if it was simply drawn from some machine, would have been able to take the Grand Prix of the world. Industrial Exhibition EXPO 58 in Brussels, where the achievements of Soviet designers and constructors were highly appreciated by specialized specialists, even before the start of serial production, that is, in 1958. Due to the specific purpose of GAZ-13, the essence of which was to serve the party and nomenclatura top brass, many contemporaries considered this car conservative and did not consider the frame Chaika to be the last word of automotive technology, recognizing its modernity only in transmission respect, because the Chaika was equipped with automatic transmission, which deserves a separate section in our today's showdown. However, skepticism about the technical progressiveness of GAZ-13 is absolutely in vain. Many technical solutions in this car in the Soviet automobile industry are really for the first time. For example, the classic, it would seem, solution in the form of a frame structure of the body received a new reading in this case, because the X-shaped frame had no side members, and the body was attached to it through rubber pads. In addition to the torque converter and planetary gearbox, the Chaika received such comfort options as power steering and vacuum brake booster. The tires were tubeless, again for the first time in the Soviet automobile industry. One should not discount the V-shaped engine, which was also equipped with a centrifugal oil filter for the first time. But that's not all. The new Soviet car, though not designed for mere mortals, received a 5-band radio receiver with auto-tuning and electric antenna drive, as well as power windows. Folding straponettes were intended for guards and other attendants. Even motorists who are quite far from domestic cars of the middle of the last century know that both Chaikas were equipped with automatic transmission, which was considered a real gimmick in the USSR. After all, except for buses LAZ, it was impossible to meet automatic transmission on Soviet vehicles, and all without exception Chaikas, were equipped only with such a box, which at that time was called GMP. It consisted of a hydraulic transformer and a planetary three-stage gear with a transformation ratio of 2.35. The original solution was a push-button automatic selector located on the front panel. The predecessor ZIM was also characterized by a very original transmission solution, a hydraulic clutch, which was located between the engine and the clutch. It allowed the driver to start from almost any gear and provided a high level of comfort due to the softness of shifts. However, the fluid coupling was not analogous to an automatic, because the driver still had to change gears himself, even though he had to do it much less often than in a car with a conventional manual. GAZ-13 received a classic hydromechanical transmission, created in the image and likeness of the automatic transmission on the Americans of those years. And it was for this purpose that NOMI purchased a couple of Packards, as well as 2 copies of Ford Mainline in the mid-50s. Although NOMI had been working on the GMP for several years before that, in particular, on the Project D2 for the Victory, and also the NOMA DK automatic was equipped with an experimental minivan NOMI 013. But it is impossible to consider Chaika the first Soviet car with automatic, because a couple of years earlier in the series went another sedan model from Gorky, Volga GAZ-21, which at first was also equipped with automatic transmission. Approximately 1,500 21sts, produced in the period from 1957 to 1959, were equipped with a hydro-automatic, structurally similar to the Ford-Fordomatic. Alas, due to the lack of the necessary ATF oil and low technical culture of servicemen, most of the Soviet automatics on Volgas failed rather quickly, forcing many owners to install the usual 3-stage mechanics instead of the unusual box a couple of years after purchase. Because of the automatic transmission, the Chaika was deprived of a crooked starter, so when it was necessary to turn the engine crankshaft, for example, when adjusting the ignition, this operation was carried out in an unusual way, with a screwdriver, which rested in the teeth of the torque converter crown. This allowed to turn the crankshaft on the spot, but to get to the teeth, the designers had to provide a special hatch in the lower part of the gearbox. Government limousines sometimes received some additional modifications of the body, for example, phaeton, but not utilitarian practical, to which the body of a station wagon belongs. Limousine or phaeton, originally the variants of the body type sounded like that. And only so. However, the 2-volume Chaika did exist, although it had nothing to do with cargo transportation. To be more precise, by the will of fate Chaika Universal regularly transported special-purpose cargoes, live and very valuable. In the early 70s, as part of the 4th Main Directorate of the Ministry of Health of the USSR, a new institution appeared. United Special Hospital with Polyclinic, which popularly received the unofficial name Kremlin Hospital or Kremlevka. This medical organization treated almost all high-ranking officials and leaders of the country, whose age at that time had already become advanced. It was decided to create special vehicles to service the Kremlevka, which would allow the hospitalization of high-ranking patients in case of need. In order to quickly create such a car with little blood, it was decided to use the GAZ-13, of course, with a much modified body, which in accordance with the purpose of the car was to turn into a large station wagon. The height of the roof did not matter much, because the patient was lying down in the cabin during transportation, and any resuscitative actions or other emergency medical assistance on the way was not supposed to be performed. However, they tried to attach a high roof to the Chaika, but then realized that it would require 2 large-scale modifications and would affect the appearance of the car in a bad way. Since the Gorky automobile plant was overloaded with orders not only for the passenger car industry, but also for the national economy, and the military-industrial complex, the Riga Bus Factory, RAF, which had a great experience in serial production of sanitary minibuses, was to be engaged in piece production of station wagons based on the 13th. It had both suitable production facilities, small series workshop in Riga, and a staff of highly qualified modelers and tinsmiths. The unusual project was headed by engineer Artur Isat, who was the author of the appearance of the avant-garde concept RAF 982, which later became the nation's favorite Rafik. The standard sedans that arrived in Riga from Gorky were partially disassembled, removing fragments of the roof and trunk. The new roof consisted of 3 parts, and a 5th liftgate appeared at the rear of the body. Another distinctive feature of the GAZ-13C was a pair of additional side windows, which made the car 8-window. In addition to stretchers for transportation of the patient in the supine position, there were seats for accompanying personnel, and the spare tire was located in a special niche behind the left rear false door, which did not provide access to the cabin. Technically, the special station wagon almost completely repeated the usual Chaika, even keeping the classic for the executive sedan, and extremely uncharacteristic for the ambulance radical black body color, because of which this car was often called Black Doctor. If under the hood of the ZIM was a conventional inline-six, the Chaika received a V-shaped multi-cylinder engine, which was common for American cars of this class. However, there was no such engine in the USSR, and later V8 engines were massively used only on trucks, Lawn, GAZ-53, and Shishiga, GAZ-66. Because of this, many not too technically literate drivers of Gorky trucks began to believe that Chaika received a truck unit, although, in reality, everything was exactly the opposite. Taking the Chrysler 8 as a basis, GAZ creatively reinterpreted it, having unified its V8 with the engine of the 21st. Volga by details of the piston group and gas distribution mechanism, and the cylinder block, and heads, and intake manifold and even the pistons of the Chaika motor were made of aluminum alloy. This solution at that time was not just progressive, but extremely rare even in world practice. Chaika engine, 8 cylinders, over 5 liters and almost 200 horses, the first prototypes with a working volume of 4 greater than 89 liters produced about 180 horsepower, and after a number of tests in 1958, experts considered their power insufficient, increasing the literage to 5.5 liters, which allowed to remove 195 horses from the engine. The motor developed a torque of 412 Nm at 2,200 RPM, so, even despite the automatic transmission, the Chaika could accelerate to 160 km/h, gaining the first 100 in 20 seconds. Dear Leonid Ilyich drove Zils and his favorite foreign cars, but if he wished, he could pose against the backdrop of a Chaika. So, the answer to the question, who stood on who, is simple and unambiguous. This engine was designed specifically for Chaika and later in a slightly modified form was used not only on trucks, but even on BRDM2. Moreover, it was on the basis of the Tchaikovsky engine that versions of ZMZ engines with a reduced displacement were created, which were then installed on GAZ trucks and PAZ buses for many years. Since the predecessor of the Chaika carried the official index M12, the new limousine was to receive the next number, that is, it was to become M13. However, due to the fact that Molotov for the attempt to oust Khrushchev fell into disgrace and was removed from all posts in 1957, the factory designation of the new car was changed to GAZ-13, not paying attention to its belonging to the damn dozen. In addition to the dry alphanumeric code, the new model also received its own name, Chaika, although in the early stages a variant of the name Strela was also considered. Every year in Gorky produced about 1,500 Chaika, and a total of 3,179 copies of GAZ-13 were produced from 1959 to 1980. Interestingly, for some time, since 1977, the first-generation limousine was produced simultaneously with the GAZ-14. According to a beautiful legend, since the GAZ-13 belonged to a higher class than the 21st, thanks to its name Chaika seemed to soar over the Volga in all senses, including semantic. Marketers of the All-Union Association Auto Export tried to tie the name of the car to reality in a simpler way, explaining the ornithological name of the car by the fact that the residents of Gorky often admire how seagulls swiftly fly over the surface of the great Russian river Volga, on which the city stands. Be that as it may, the Chaika car really has a connection with the Volga, because both of these cars were created at the same time and by the same people. Surprising fact, ZIM in the USSR theoretically could be purchased for personal use by anyone, as GAZ-12 was officially sold as freely as Pobeda and Moskvichi. However, before the 1961 reform, the ZIM cost an exorbitant 40,000 rubles, that is, almost 4 times more expensive than the Moskvich. Minus 400, 9,000 rubles, and almost 3 times more expensive than the Victory, 16,000 rubles. That is why for the majority of Soviet citizens with their salaries the cost of the ZIM and its hypothetical availability were of only speculative interest. The new limousine, unlike its predecessor, never worked in a cab and was not intended for sale to privateers even at the concept level. Therefore, to be behind the wheel of the GAZ-13 could only be a professional driver, who was to turn the big crank on duty. And, of course, Only really experienced drivers were trusted to drive the car intended for transportation of high-ranking officials. Nevertheless, a mere mortal could take a ride in the Chaika, not alone, but together with his other half and in the company of friends. However, only as a passenger and at a certain moment, after the Chaikas served their appointed term in various departments and ministries. They underwent overhaul and were often transferred to registry offices and marriage palaces. It was there that the Blackbird could be rented, which 40 years ago cost a person wishing to ride in a staff with a driver. In 50 rubles, that is, twice as expensive as it was necessary to give for a similar time rental Volga. However, such a service was in demand, and many newly minted Soviet families used to drive into the bright future in the Chaika saloon. In conclusion, the GAZ-13 Chaika stands as a fascinating blend of myth and reality, embodying the spirit of Soviet innovation and design. Its unique appearance, often likened to that of an alien spacecraft, captures the imagination, while its status as the first Soviet automatic and station wagon body showcases the technological advancements of its time. By separating fact from fiction, we gain a deeper appreciation for this iconic vehicle and its place in automotive history. The Chaika not only reflects the era's aspirations but also continues to intrigue enthusiasts and collectors around the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the myths and facts surrounding the GAZ-13 Chaika.